If you're now pruning your bonsai, you might notice that sap comes from the branches. Is this a problem? Will your tree die? Flowering hazel, a sign winter is almost over. Now, dear viewer, if you just came here to figure out, does bleeding harm my maple bonsai? Then the answer is no, it doesn't. Considering it is maple syrup season, is it just part of nature? Japanese maples are great species for bonsai, but many people are worried about bleeding. Why am I not worried about bleeding, and why am I pruning and wiring the maple also in early spring? Cold nights, warm days, and the sap starts flowing. Pruning trees from the ABC group, A, Acer, that is maples, B, Betulus, that's birches, and C, Carpinus, that's hornbeams, can lead to bleeding, especially in early spring, and to subsequent death. So, do not prune your maples, your hornbeams, or your birches in early spring. That is a common understanding that lots and lots of people have. An interesting question is why only these three families bleed in spring and all the other deciduous, they don't. So I have this Japanese maple that I've been growing from a stump over the last couple of years, and typically somewhere around December, January, like the Christmas break, I start wiring these out. That involves also making smaller cuts. Here a side branch is gone, I've reduced these branches here, and I can tell that this year spring is very early, or actually winter is very late, and there is still sap movement. From some of the cuts I see sap dripping after removing the wood. Everybody I think knows of maple syrup, right? You go to, I think, Canada, and there in early spring, late winter, they start tapping the maples. The maples don't actually die of the liquid taken from the plant. And why is that? Why doesn't the maple really care about us taking this liquid? Well, what a maple loses when they're bleeding, or what a hornbeam loses when they're bleeding, is sap, right? Everybody knows that one. But what is really in sap? The major part of sap is a little bit of energy, some salts and water. Besides that, there's nothing really of relevance in sap. Now, as long as you have your plants potted up and watered well, losing some water is not a problem, right? I think everybody will agree with me there as well. So why are we so worried about losing sap? Well, one of the things that people believe is that sap holds a large amount of energy. Did you, for instance, know that a healthy maple can flush 3 times on the reserves that it has, and that therefore losing a little bit of water really is not an issue? Keep in mind, sap is very different from the material that you would find in blood. Animal blood is more than just water. Water is really just a transport for the cells that are in the blood. It contains white blood cells for the defense, contains red blood cells for oxygen transport, and with that it is a limited resource for the plant, for the animal. The animal really actively needs to create blood cells, and therefore bleeding for the animal, it really is an issue. For plants, not so much. The tree can quite easily replenish the water that it loses when it is bleeding. So does this mean that I'm now actively advocating making big cuts in early spring? Because, well, hey, you know what? It doesn't matter to the tree? No, of course not. Making big cuts is something very different from having smaller pruning scars in the beginning of the season on small branches that you're pruning back. Big cuts, like the one here, I actually do not make over winter. I do open up the wounds a little bit, the edges, removing a little bit of the bark, and then I'll put new cut paste on. But that is most work that I do on these. These big cuts I do in early spring, late spring actually, after the first flush has sprouted, has extended. That is for me the moment that I make these bigger cuts on the tree. Right now it's only maintenance. But that is also not because I'm worried about the tree bleeding to death. No, cutting back now I am more concerned about the potential of dieback, because the tree can't really respond to the cut made. Now I've been asking around, trying to find out who has had a bonsai die because of bleeding. And I've not found a lot of people that could actually tell me that they had. Most people would tell me no, but it took a very long time for the bleeding to stop. And that's true. It can take quite a long time for the plant to realize, oh, hang on, I'm losing lots and lots of sap. I need to fix whatever wound is there. But actual trees dying, hardly anybody confirmed that they had the problems. And the ones that did confirm death of a tree typically had trees that were already weak the year beforehand. So the bleeding could have just been the result. So the death of the bleeding could have just been the result of not having a healthy tree. So the tree was not able to build up reserves in time in the last season. Then it goes weak into winter. And then you cause massive trauma to the tree. Then yes, of course, I agree, a tree can succumb to the bleeding. Now what I found an interesting question is why only these 3 families bleed in spring and all the other deciduous, they don't. So I went on and then explored a little bit, and what I found out is that this is the way that they deal with differences in cold and warm nights. As you get more and more difference between cold and warm nights, the plant protects itself from this by pushing the sap that has built up during the day out into the wood. So it goes out from the normal sap and it goes in between spaces. And somehow this protects the tree from nighttime frosts. I found that a really interesting tidbit. I don't know how it exactly works, but it does mean that the water that comes out, if I clip here, is actually not coming directly from the regular silene. It's coming from the actual wood. Never knew that. So now you know why I also wire my bonsai, prune my bonsai in early spring, late winter, at the moment that there's a risk of bleeding, and I'm not so concerned with the bleeding of my tree. I don't believe it will do serious damage. I am making sure that my tree is of course well watered, but that's not a problem. It's raining so much. It has been fertilized well last year, it's been growing well last year, so it's all set for a happy, healthy season. Now if you are concerned and your tree starts bleeding, and your tree is dripping with sap and you don't know what to do, this is a very simple trick, a very simple thing you could do. You can just take the tree out of the pot, prune the roots and repot it. So basically a regular repotting will stop your tree immediately with bleeding. Now knowing that the Japanese maple can bleed in early spring, why do I still work on it? In conclusion, I don't really think it is a problem. The sap that it loses is predominantly water, a little bit of energy, but it has lots of reserves and some salts. It is not comparable to the blood that animals lose, for instance. It is predominantly water. If it keeps on bleeding, then I can just do a repot and it stops immediately. So if I'm concerned somewhere, I don't know, in April, May, and it's still dripping water, I can just fix it. But most of all, right now, the tree is gearing up for the new season. The branches are quite supple. The branches are quite flexible. I can still bend them in nice little shapes without them breaking. In the middle of winter, when it's frosty, the branches are really hard. And if I do it in fall, and I'm too late in fall, normally I am too late in fall, then there is a risk of these branches dying off over winter. So those are a couple of reasons why I think it is important to wire these out right now, which includes pruning back. Even though there's a slight risk of bleeding, which I don't really care about anyway. This was Jelle, growing bonsai, wiring out a Japanese maple, and why I do not care about bleeding. Thank you for watching. See you next time, and until then, keep growing bonsai.